Welcome everyone to tonight's MSD at Home, and it's my pleasure to welcome NORD architects who are joining us from Copenhagen. My name's Professor Alan PERT, I'm Director of the Melbourne School of Design, and I'm also Chair of EBA Melbourne, which is co-hosting tonight's talk. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which the university sits, the land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respect to elders past, present and emerging, as well as acknowledging Indigenous owners who have been successfully living, designing and making architecture on these lands for over 60,000 years. Well, it's great to be able to welcome back to Australia, even if it is virtually, Johannes Pedersen and Morten GREGERSEN of NORD Architects from Copenhagen. Now, Johannes and Morten were first here in Australia in 2015 as part of the Australian Institute of Architects Foundation DROGA Architect in Residence programme, which reflects a vision of architecture as fundamental to Australian culture. And I think it's fair to say that since the visit in 2015, it's cemented a love affair with Australia and a fascination with its architectural culture. And I know if it wasn't for COVID, earlier in the year, NORD would have joined us for an EBA Melbourne event co-hosted by NGV Design Week. Now, since establishing the practice back in 2003, Morten, Johannes and Mia Barrett Tofty, who joined as a partner in 2017, have achieved wide acclaim for a number of their projects. The House of Natural Sciences, for instance, completed in 2009, was widely published and celebrated. But it was the Centre for Cancer and Health, completed in 2011, that established a reputation in healthcare design while demonstrating that architecture can have a positive effect on people's recovery from illness. They've gone on to design a new typology of hospice care, and their Kids City project in Copenhagen has been described as the best daycare centre in the world. The project's ambition was to create a children's city for 710 children and young people. Described as a city within a city, NORD has transformed the city as an organism into a children's universe with creative approaches to density, to public spaces, to streets, and inclusion of a beach. In 2016, the practice then won the competition to realise a village for people with Alzheimer's and dementia in Dax in France. And in parallel, they won the commission for another Alzheimer's village in Oslo. More recently, they've completed a maritime education centre in Malmö in Sweden, where the education centre is set within 3,000 square metres of landscaping, including small ponds and planting that are intended to mimic an assortment of marine ecologies. Their work is clearly underpinned by an interest in how architecture can act to bring people together, to find solutions to societal challenges and build stronger communities. And all of this is captured in a recent book that was published in May 2020 that explores the vast potential and use of co-creation within NORD's work. Now, I would encourage everyone to explore NORD's website to see the range and diversity of projects the practice is engaged with. Everything from the scale of the building to neighbourhood development and major urban and landscape design commissions. But tonight's talk is focused on housing, and it follows my visit to the practice in late 2019. Morten and Johannes gave me an insight into the transformation of 3 key districts in Copenhagen and sent me off on an amazing tour of contemporary housing projects across the city, all responding to familiar issues of growth, new demographics and diverse family living patterns. Tonight, we will hear specifically about NORD's role in a number of these housing projects, but we will also hear about the new housing laboratory, a project that they are leading. With the challenges we face here in Melbourne in terms of affordability, financing, design, but also densification, I thought it would be timely to hear more about the Danish Housing Laboratory, which seeks to inspire and finance new experiments in housing. And so, a huge welcome to Johannes and Morten.
Thank you all, and thank you for the lovely introduction, Alan. Yeah, it's lovely to be able to present for you all, despite the distance, new times. And we will, it's Johannes here, and
Morten GREGERSEN here.
Yeah. And we will split our presentation today and start by sharing our screen, and hopefully everything works out. See here. But we're invited today to talk about Danish housing and how Danish housing ensure life quality to the many. We prepared a presentation. We'll introduce ourselves shortly, and then we will give sort of an oversight of the Danish housing sector, and then we will look into a little bit of the tradition and current tendency in Danish housing architecture, and then we will briefly touch upon the new housing laboratory, as Alan mentioned. But again, yeah, we are 3 partners in our office, by 25 persons at the moment, with mixed professions. Half of what we do are so-called client consulting, helping clients, private and public clients, to develop their projects, and the other half is regular architecture and urban planning work. We're situated in Copenhagen, which is in itself can be termed as a laboratory for development. The recent 15 to 20 years has been a lot of things happening in Copenhagen by urban standards and building standards. Our approach towards architecture is that we try to approach the content we built for with empathy. And the method for doing that is that we use a high degree of co-creation processes when we design. But looking into the Danish welfare state and housing sector, they are actually very much the two of the same thing. If you look into what the local context in Denmark is, we will sort of give an overview of what is Denmark. It's a very small country in Northern Europe, of course, adjacent to Sweden and Germany. Very little area, basically. Most of it is agriculture. We are about 5.8 million people. Capital is Copenhagen, as I said, known for its especially its sort of low skyline and urban housing. Of course, we have a democracy of a parliamentary system, and that is very much based upon an old movement, old co-op movement in Denmark, which was formed to provide the different functions that were needed at the time. And that sort of co-op spirit is still very much a part of the Danish democracy today. And you can say the welfare society, welfare model in Scandinavia has been highly praised as sort of a supermodel for how an ideal society should be. You can say, despite that, there's some maybe some heavy illogical structural things. We have a very high taxation here in Denmark. You can see what we're spending the money on in our brute net diagram here, and a lot of it is for the health sector, education, and social sector. What we live from is basically by exporting. So we are sort of a vulnerable economy, which means that the welfare state is heavily under pressure for globalization, climate change, changes in demographics, and a general greater expectations to the public for a more individual welfare. And this has to do with the housing sector as well, which we will describe. Despite all this, we are often ranked as one of the 3 happiest countries in the world since it was first monitored. And that is a lot to do with our free healthcare and education, but also our housing situation. It's a sort of an accessible housing sector for most of us in Denmark. And a high life expectancy, of course, and an official approach from the government. They have official architecture policy that are very much focusing on architecture for people. That is sort of the headline for the governmental architecture as a strategy. So architecture and urban life for people is sort of always been key for much of the development in the building industry in Denmark. Focusing on life between buildings has been sort of a key approach since the 70s, meaning that what you build should be well connected to public spaces. And when we develop our cities, especially Copenhagen, it's also a lot towards the soft infrastructure for walking and bicycle, as you can see here for the diagram. Describing the housing market in Denmark, it's a little bit special in general. We have a high degree of private ownership in Denmark. That is both for detached housing, but it's also private-owned apartments in general. So what we have a little bit special model is this 8% of co-op housing, and that is a very special model where you actually co-own a whole building together with the all other inhabitants in the house, and also these 21%, which is non-profit public housing associations. They are spread over the whole of Denmark and are having a huge existing building mass, but they are also in this years developing a lot of new housing. And that is also a special model in Denmark, which is in principle, legally wise, co-owned by all the inhabitants together. And meaning that they are also, during the years, they have accumulated a lot of revenue and a lot of money in their associations. So they have a lot of power to build for themselves. They are regulated by the state because they get subsidies for building, which means that the way you can build these non-profit public housing is sort of quite limited price per square meter. But despite that, you see a lot of development and innovation going on from these housing associations. If you see in Copenhagen numbers, the co-op housing part is even higher, which means that you have a sector in Copenhagen where a lot of people own their own houses and apartments. This was a model created so it should be possible for people to enter the housing market. So they were in general quite cheap to buy, and you're having a cheap rent as well. And if you see sort of across the largest cities in the whole of Denmark, there's a high degree of private owned apartments and non-profit housing in general. So they are actually some of the main drivers for the housing developments in Denmark. All new development areas in Copenhagen and in general in Denmark are being regulated so that they demand that 25% of all new apartments is to be public housing from these organizations that I just described. And that is to try to stimulate that all urban development in the largest university cities we have is going to provide affordable housing in the city center still. Yeah, I think I will give the word to Morten.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I'll try and bring you through some of the kind of historic housing schemes we kind of form the future on. Basically, we often say that we stand on the shoulders of this generation of the golden age of Danish architects. We at the moment we are not trying to build a welfare state. We already have the welfare state, so we're actually redefining it or restructuring it. So therefore, it's interesting for us as architects to look at this period of time where architects really had a big impact on our society and on the housing market in general. So this example is from central Copenhagen part. This is the lake in Copenhagen, which is the old defense system surrounding the old inner part of the historic Copenhagen. By Kai Fisker, Arne Jacobsen, a well-known modernist Danish architect. A picture from the coast in Hellerup, north of Copenhagen, where he built both his own house, but also a series of row houses. So you see this kind of functionalist historic projects that really founded the basis for Danish architecture being well-known both in Scandinavia, but also around the world. Here, Jørgen Utzon, of course, well known in Australia, his own house from 52, where you see some of the inspiration also from Japanese architecture mixed with this kind of modern Mies van der Rohe-like schemes integrated into his own house. Finn Juhl, a very well-known and celebrated furniture architect, also did his own house in 42, and you see some of his furniture integrated into this functionalist villa. And a lot of these villas were actually inspiring the detached houses being built in the Danish suburbs through the 60s and 70s. So they had a direct impact on what was built throughout Denmark in those years. Here you see Poul Henningsen, a part of the cultural radical movement in Denmark, his own house from 37, built in this light concrete material, something that was kind of there was a big outcry in the area when this was built. It was seen as a complete alien in the environment where it was brick buildings and so on, but really a radical project at the time. It's just been refurbished to its original state. It's a super beautiful project. Here you see even the walls he designed himself. This is actually naked women dancing around on the walls and on the paper the walls are made of. So a really radical project at the time. Here, more classical architect Haldor Gunnløgsson's own house from 58, also very much inspired from Japanese architecture. We share this kind of love of both furniture and these minimalist interior architecture pieces. I think here you see all the details, the craftsmanship that goes into the villa that he designed for himself. And all of this kind of brings us back to this relation between architecture, craftsmanship, and how we, in this golden age, integrated the two. We built in wood, we built in concrete, and so on, but in a very kind of a sensitive way, where we saw it as a kind of complete design from the furniture to the actual house, to the villa, and so on. And also bringing that into a bigger scale where the furniture was actually not expensive at the time. It was made for the masses. It was made for many people to be able to afford these nice designs, and therefore it also had this kind of how can you say a view on not design should not be for the few, but actually for the many. These then became classics and are, of course, today fairly expensive furniture to buy. But here you see some of the, it was 36 krona at the time, which is around something like $7 Australian when they were sold. So it was really mainstream furniture that became these classics. But it was all founded in this idea of a kind of that it should be for the many. And when we go up in scale from the detached housing, it was similar aspects that the architects tried to integrate into their designs, this craftsmanship, the shared spaces, and so on. Here you see a really large-scale project from that period with a huge courtyard in the center where all the different apartments share the inner courtyard here, which is a lovely green space. And also when we started doing this kind of dense areas, it was done in this functionalist way where you have the landscape flowing in between the different housing units. You share the space in between when you are in these 3-story high buildings here from 32 to 34 by Ivar Benson. Also the influence from Bauhaus, the modernist movement, affected also Arne Jacobsen, and he went from these yellow brick projects very much founded in our tradition to kind of update it and let it be influenced by this Bauhaus movement. So this is one of the very early projects from 34, also at the north coast of Copenhagen, a beautiful project. But it also became more mainstream, and this Svend Eske Christensen is one of these Danish architects that actually built a lot of different projects in this state period where we defined our welfare state. And this type of plan and this type of housing you can see in numerous places around Denmark, where you again share common spaces inside the plans. You see the landscape and kind of glue of the area present everywhere. No segregation between the different housing units and so on. So really thinking about how to integrate housing, how to integrate people and make them work as a community in their area. Here you see Utzon's Roma housing, where he, in a smaller scale, unfortunately, Utzon didn't get to build that much in Denmark after he left the Sydney Opera. He was in bad standing in Denmark, but that's a long story. But here, one of his very beautiful housing projects, where you see, again, in a smaller scale, individual housing put together in this kind of a structural movement that allows the landscape to be integrated into the scheme in a very beautiful way, with a lake here as a central piece in the scheme. So it was very much kind of again using the kind of fundamental heritage of craftsmanship in our housing schemes and letting the kind of social aspect influence it in a very positive way. And here we go a bit further on into the 50s, where you see Svend Eske Christensen again doing a high-rise scheme where you're actually overlooking Copenhagen. It's called Bella Høj or Bella High. So you're looking out onto the city. And here you start going away from the craftsmanship and going into this more industrial production, into concrete structures that are built in a fairly fast manner. It was a period where we really needed housing after the Second World War. So there's a big demand for the old quarters of Copenhagen to be refurbished, and people moved into these luxury apartments at the time. This project is actually being refurbished at the moment. It's a cultural heritage protected scheme. So it's going through a huge refurbishment right now. And here into even denser, bigger projects in the suburbs, like 7-8 kilometers out of the central part of Copenhagen, where you see a really high density scheme, but again done in a way where there's only these I think 4 blocks, and they've been refurbished away, but still done in a way where it's not one of the big Corbusian schemes being executed, but actually limited in size, and actually functioning still fairly well today. Some of these schemes from that time actually are not functioning anymore, and this scheme from Brøndby, south of Copenhagen, is a bit later. It's from the 60s and 70s, where again the concrete element kind of background formed this period very much. So these are actually outdated now and are being torn down, and there will be new housing built afterwards. So these structures actually showed themselves to be obsolete, both technically but also socially, that we in the 60s and 70s filled them with the wrong kind of homogeneous group of people that have a high rate of unemployment, a high rate of crime, and so on. So we're actually trying to fix these projects, some of them by taking all of it down, and some of them by being refurbishing them, which you can see later on. A bit later, we went into this high, what's it called, low dense movement. Here, a project by Vandkunsten, a very kind of idealistic and influential office that went kind of in a movement against these concrete high-rise projects from the 60s and 70s. So these schemes were influencing throughout the 80s and 90s a lot, and were built many places, but again a focus back on bringing the social kind of aspects into the housing schemes, sharing more spaces, sharing facilities, and living in a scale of housing that was still in a kind of a human scale. And when we bring all of these kind of historical projects up to now, and here the lecture kind of goes into showing you what are going on at the moment. We are, as we said earlier, we are refurbishing some areas, but we are also creating completely new areas. Here you see a map of Copenhagen with the old historical center here, with the lakes where we saw Kai Fisker's project in the beginning. And we are, of course, taking over the old industrial harbor areas here to the north, the North Harbor. We are building a completely new island here to stop the flooding or potential flooding in the future from the climate changes and the rising sea level coming into the harbor here. We created in the 90s this plan for Ørestad, a completely new settlement on a landfill project. All of this island here is actually landfill. And then we have the South Harbor over here, which are also being developed, which we're going to show a project from as well. So from our old harbor area, which was of course industrialized up till the 80s, we now are introducing new housing, as we see many places throughout Europe and also globally. We are building new houses in these kind of obsolete harbor areas. We are doing this in a company structure where the municipality and the state has made a collaborative company that by selling the land here, finance the metro for Copenhagen. So the business case is actually a bit complicated, but again, it is that when we develop these new areas, we are giving back to society and financing the preliminary infrastructural needs we have in the future. Significant things of these plans are looking into infrastructure. The parking are detached and centralized in parking houses. We are creating a high density settlements. We are using old industrial heritage buildings to create significant new buildings to kind of link up with the industrial heritage. These are, again, as Johannes said, 25% of these housing areas need to be social housing. by law, so it's integrated. This is a kind of luxury housing, but next to them would be social housing. So we're really trying to mix these areas as well as possible. Here there's a restaurant on top. But this mix of things are extremely important in the new areas we create, and we of course use the water and the blue element of Copenhagen in the best possible way to create these, like we had the green areas in the schemes from the 50s and 60s. We here use the blue elements to create new urban areas that are for all the people of Copenhagen. So the summer, even though there was Corona, that you would see this area packed with people from all over Copenhagen coming here, and they actually needed to close down these areas because of the Corona virus. But extremely popular places that are created, and again, simultaneously financing the metro system of Copenhagen. A more sensitive area here to the South Harbour, where one of the last plots having the old identity of the harbour are supposed to be developed, and we attended this competition. It was an extremely sensitive political area because it's the last kind of part of the harbour with the old cultural kind of still present there. So old fishermen, old people working on the boats and so on, this kind of thing that we love to have in our cities was supposed to live side by side with a new development of housing. And here we also go into a new era where sustainability, building in wood, all the focus coming from the climate changes, all of a sudden kind of influence housing and the way we're developing these housing areas a lot. So the political change in the last 10 years has been immense on how we develop these places and how technically we develop them as well. But we still look back into history, try to integrate the social aspects of our housing areas. We try to create as many common facilities as possible in the scheme, really try to plan for social interacting, plan for sharing facilities, plan for how these areas can be lively and well functioning from the beginning. So the project you saw with the large kind of concrete modernist schemes are really not an inspiration, but we are looking further back into history to try to form these areas and try to create the social glue in the best possible way. And here, if it of course has to do with integrating the existing structures, looking at how are they actually functioning, these settlements that has the kind of culture present within them today. So this is where the old fishermen work with the boats, where they have their small places for businesses, small workshops and so on. And how can we use a similar structure in a bigger scale and integrate it in the best possible way in a scheme like this? How can we finance these shared spaces by actually letting the housing units pay for shared space that are not integrated into their actual building, but are integrated into the urban overall scheme? So it actually has a kind of profound impact on the business case behind these places, that we are able to create these common facilities, to create spaces that we kind of didn't develop in our schemes from the 70s and 60s. Here you see pictures from a scheme like this with the common facilities, the housing next to it, adjacent to these common spaces, where you integrate biophilia, you integrate nature as much as possible, the harbor culture and so on, but also the common facilities where you could actually share tools, you can share kitchen appliances, all these things that can create a sense of community into a place like this. In a place which is not the harbor, Ørestad, we actually, I think it's developed 50% at the moment. We are also looking at how you can say that in the last 10 years we developed 50%, which is done in a classic concrete manner. But this focus on sustainability has brought us into looking at wood and looking at how to lower the CO2 levels of our housing schemes, looking at how to work with buildings that could be taken apart in the future when they're obsolete and so on, but really focusing on CO2 very much in our buildings. And this, I took this in, this is my own house built in 2 years ago in CLT, in cross-laminated timber, where we as an office actually made, we wanted to test out how to lower CO2 in our building designs and wanted to go forward and be kind of at the forefront of this change in housing. So this was our small experiment on how to do that. You see the CLT, all of the structure done in wood and CLT on the inside, and also cladded in wood outside. So it has a very low energy use, but it's also focusing on the CO2 spent on actually building the project. And this of course changes the whole way we as architects kind of build. How do we prefabricate in wood? It's done in Austria in this case, in CNC robot cut cross-laminated timber. It's brought to the site. It's built in 2 days, the whole structure, and so on. Learning all these things to bring it into, or we wanted to bring it into a bigger market for housing, and thereby lowering the CO2 use in our buildings. This project is in a similar character. It's done by ONV Architects. It's called the
Friendly Houses.
Friendly Houses. It's a new scheme trying to integrate, again, socially subsidized housing units, prefabricated units, with shared spaces in the structure. So it's again a new take on using technology, prefabrication, and try to almost create a scheme a bit like you saw from the 80s, but also further back, where you actually work differently with the craftsmanship brought into the actual housing scheme. But a very successful project, again, subsidized by the state, and thereby it's a very cheap project done with a very low
yeah, and they even have a system for taking care of new coming immigrants, so they actually are living in some of the apartment, and so they have sort of a social structure of how to integrate them into the housing scheme and the society in general. That's why it's called friendly houses.
Other experiments done in Ørestad earlier on was, of course, the projects by BIG, by Bjarke Ingels Group, some of his very early work, where, again, trying to integrate parking not on the surface in between the housing, but actually in the buildings themselves. So I think this was a very successful project showing that how to hybridize parking and housing, where you actually get almost like a series of spaces inspired by the Utzon scheme with it's this similar kind of angled of housing, angled small units here on top that are spread out throughout this mountain, as it's called, but a very significant, iconic housing scheme in Ørestad. Even earlier, the VM houses, where you have double height apartments, a very complex building where each apartment are individualized, are very unique. Again, a very significant example of housing done in the last, it's 20-year-old, the project now. And down to his last project where row housing are combined with apartment blocks here in the middle part, and an open ground floor in the bottom that then are connected by this overall shape, and you have common facilities here in the middle, and you have restaurants here at the end. Again, I think an experiment that kind of points towards history and some of the earlier projects we show, but done in a very modern expression in Ørsted. Here you see a more classical kind of take on that, perhaps. But the influence, and that's why we chose to show you a few projects that are not our own, but that right now we are really emphasizing on sustainability in Copenhagen. And you see the top part of Ørsted here. There's a big political kind of mess. This was supposed to be kind of built all the way up to the center of Copenhagen, but because of some kind of biophilia and
leaf frogs,
different frogs, this area was actually taken out by the politicians. Instead, they chose to move the building site over here, which was a bit odd in terms of the overall planning of Ørsted. So you have the metro line here, and kind of now a nature preservation area here in the middle, and then you build here centrally on this big green area of Ørsted. But the scheme are very interesting. It again are the last kind of iteration of housing schemes in Copenhagen. It's all going to be built in wood. It's financed by a pension company, and there are the winning entry here by Henning Larsen shows this kind of open system where each area of the site are this almost like a leaf-like structure that embraces the green area behind it, brings in the biophilia into the green area of all three different parts of the scheme. You see the kind of traces of the old pathways on the side. And again, everything are supposed to be built in wood. And this project is just been approved. In the local plan of it has just been approved, and they are now starting to design each individual building again in a co-op manner, where the different plots collaborate throughout the design process, and also in the production of the housing. They look into prefabricated wood elements. They look into cross-laminated timber and so on to lower the CO2 use in the overall structure. But I think again it shows a bit of a mix in our kind of historical examples, going from the very early detached housing here towards the green area. We go up to this semi-scaled buildings from the 80s, and then up to a higher scale here towards the center of each of the three different areas of the scheme. So it's really trying to mix as much as possible into one scheme, and also perhaps relying a bit on, you can say it's mixing the big scheme here in a different way. It's more open towards the context, but it integrates many different typologies into one overall scheme. So it's perhaps the high point of how many different things you could put into one area. Here towards the south, a project by Sweco and Linnae Architects They also took up one of the latest tendencies in Copenhagen and Denmark on planning and on political kind of influence. The UN 17 goals. Yeah, they are not showed here, but it's also done in wood. It's integrating, and again, I think we're going to show them later, the UN 17 goals. I hope you're familiar with them. It's basically overall sustainability goals that we try to integrate both in architecture and building, but also in our industry, in our education, and so on. Everything kind of bringing us towards creating a sustainable future are integrated into these 17 goals, and they have become a kind of mainstream way of communicating to everyone that we need to start to behave differently when we consume, when we shop, when we buy housing, when we do all the different aspects of our lives. We need to change the way we behave. And this scheme is on the very south. It's actually next to the 8 number project by big architects on the very corner. It shows again a high density of housing, but rely on a big kind of emphasis on the social part of the scheme, where they really try to mix the programs into the scheme in the best possible way, and again in a fairly high kind of density structure made in wood. Some of the projects from the 70s and 80s we are also restructuring. So this is an example from Aarhus, the second largest project in Denmark, the second largest city in Denmark, sorry, where we again have a big concrete social housing area where we are tearing some of the blocks down and integrating new programs, new scales into the area and also around the area. And of course, this is done because we have big social problems in the area. We have a high degree of unemployment, criminality, and so on. So really trying to do this in a way where we both tear apartment blocks down, integrate nature, integrate green elements into the plan, and make architectural features that give it a new brand or a new identity that would attract different inhabitants into the area. So we really try to achieve a higher degree of mix of inhabitants. So we don't not only have low income people working or living there, but we want students, we want normal families with jobs and so on to move into these areas again. But very interesting projects where we, adjacent to this project, have an example. We just finished this recently. This is the first picture of the project. We have a hard time getting our photographer taking pictures of it, also because of the Corona. But an example of youth housing, which has been subsidized. Again, it's a very cheap, low-income housing. And as they are subsidized, they have a certain specific size for each apartment. So it's around 65 square meters for each apartment. And what we've done here is take as many square meters out of the apartment as possible and bringing it into the common areas. So what you see as the double height, the lit up spaces here are the social spaces, the shared spaces in the structure. So even though it has a high degree of repetition in terms of the housing units for these young people, we also want to integrate this this common idea into the project. This idea of being able to make new spaces for new. It's for instance for new companies and startups can be made by the young people. They can get help from the municipality and so on to create these small new businesses. bringing that into a housing scheme, I think, is extremely important. But it also creates kind of a significance into the structures. They can have different elements implemented into them so they don't become too monotone and too kind of monofunctional. Here you see the scheme in it's 14,000 square meters, and you see the shared courtyard in the middle. Here are some of the pictures from our competition proposal, from the common spaces inside, where the young people share spaces and can work together, and so on. Here you see the adjacent areas, which are going to be again also housing, but with families and so on, and with the big social housing scheme that are being refurbished next to this area. So it's many different elements that tweak us in the direction of creating an area that are once again social, sustainable for the future. Here you see the different apartments inside the scheme, and some of the common spaces and the shared area inside the overall structure. Here I zoom in on the project. Unfortunately, we can't show you more images, but we hope our photographer soon can go there to take pictures again. But again, a mix of wanting to integrate the scale, the human scale, into a fairly dense scheme are something we are working on very much. And the focus on creating a social and economical sustainable model for our housing scheme are extremely important.
Yeah, I think I have 10 minutes left to talk a little bit about what we call the housing laboratory. Despite these examples from both our history and tradition, and new build projects within the 10-15 years, the majority of the new builds, despite that we had a good economy running, has been very much the same, very much based on same approach to housing layout, apartment layouts, which means that the building mass that has been created within the last 20 years is very homogeneous, monofunctional, and actually are not answering on many of the demands that are coming today. So, and what are they demands? I mean, you can see in Copenhagen the interesting case that actually the density in 1900 was much higher than it is today. So there's a demand on looking on the density, how to build to newcomers to Copenhagen. Today we use a lot more space than they used back in 1900, and that demands also that the spaces we create, both urban spaces and indoor spaces, are quite multifunctional. And you can see that the extensive city is basically created because every sector in the city, if it goes for the housing or the private sector, the road association, park association, and so on, they have their own department in the municipal, having their own regulations, own rules and own layouts. So the result is a very extensive city. But what is happening now is that municipal wants to do things more compact, to combine things, to create new synergies between things, and they are also therefore they need to organize themselves differently between these silos in the municipal and the organizations. The demands of the new demographic in the world and in Denmark are also affecting the housing market. We are getting older, and more of us are older. We are living longer. The population is rising, also Copenhagen-wise. For the first time ever, there's more people in the world plus 65 than 0 to 5 years in the world. So we have this changing in demographics, and life expectancy is rising, fertility rates are declining. So what do that do to our housing mass? There's a sort of a demographic issue we need to take care of. Also, housing for people with cognitive difficulties, dementia and so on are rising. The demands for new typologies within senior housing, healthy aging is rising. The demands for building to different family patterns are rising. This is a recent mapping in Denmark where the statement is that there are actually around 37 different kinds of family patterns and family forms, but we primarily built to one form, which is 2 adults and 2 children. So we also need to look into this in a different way in our housing mass. As Morten mentioned before, the 17 UN Development Goals are being an integrated part of our urban and housing development in Denmark. The demands for a better social sustainability is pressuring the housing market. The demands for thinking elderly and healthcare in our city and housing is a rising demand. Coexistent issues with businesses and housing and different social groups are rising in demands. So in order to answer all these new demands and pressures, there's also been a seeking for new typologies, whether it's one of the examples Morten showed, or this example from our dementia village in Norway. So all these pressure things and demands resulted in what we call the housing laboratory. We in NORD Architecture are running a secretariat for this project, and it's a project initiated by what is called the Art Foundation of the Danish government, which has a board for the different arts and also architecture. They wanted to support the housing development in Denmark, and they founded a partnership with REORGANIZE, which is the largest fund in the world for the built environment. It has a lot of money, which is a result of a restructuring of the lending funding market for housing in Denmark several years ago. And they are supporting different projects in Denmark. But they decided to partnership, and we formulated this concept of a housing laboratory. Sadly, I can't show that much from the housing laboratory yet, because it's sort of just started, but I will tell what we're going to do. Basically, we are handing in money to 7 projects that are going to be built as experimental housing projects within the coming years. We handed out a tender invitation, and we got 62 tenders from different complete teams of developers, architects, and so on specific sites in Denmark. We choose 7 of them, and all 7 projects are really focusing on issues that need to be pushed to create the next generation of housing in Denmark. So the ambition is to restart the Danish housing industry by having a series of workshops during the years that are touching upon the difficulties and things that need to be solved in these 7 projects. And that is a range of thematics. That can be for regulations, technical issues, and so on. And then we also have a third track, which is it's generating knowledge from all these workshops, but also from the 7 projects. And we have like 7 experimental profiles that we ask them to answer on. These are let's make more from fewer resources. Let's offer new forms of living. That is tapping into the 37 family forms. Let's make the most of the potential of the nature. Let's redefine the idea of what the attracting dwelling is. Let us share, and let us strengthen the building methods, and let's use local resources. That resulted in 7 houses projects that are going to be realized now, and hopefully we can have a lecture in a couple of years' time and show the results. But basically, there's a housing project that are focusing on the self-builder concept. In Germany, you have Baugruppen. That actually private people are being the builders themselves, and you get rid of the investment part of the housing sector. The next project is Symbiosis House, is focusing on existing offices and how to build new building on top and use shared facilities. The Inclusion House is focusing on how to build a housing mass where you actually can integrate people with disabilities and cognitive problems, and so on. And the different projects are touching on many of the restraints that we as a market and architects are having at the moment, whether it's sort of building high in wood, or whether it's how to get the common shared facilities regulated properly, and so on. So we will test out all these things during these coming years, and invite the politicians, invite the regulators in this process. So basically, it's both new build, refurbishment, and small experimental parts. So overall, that's sort of the last slide we have today, and we thank you very much for listening to this excursion. I will stop the sharing of the slide now, and go over to just
Thanks very much, guys. Thanks, Morten and Johannes. It's always quite painful, I think, when you're struggling with another housing sector in a different place, looking at Copenhagen with a bit of envy at some of the quality of what you can actually produce. And I think there's a lot of questions that have come into the Q&A, so I would just encourage participants to just keep adding questions in. And we always do record these sessions, so they will be up on the MSD site in the next couple of days. There's a couple of people asked for copies of the presentation. I'm sure they all want to circulate it amongst their colleagues to show what's going on. But look, one of the things I think that we're all probably sitting curious about, given the challenges we face over here in Australia, and there's huge challenges here in terms of the public house and the social house and trying to get that affordability element up. And when you see that you've got a regulatory model of 25%, it's quite, it's the envy of us at the moment. We struggle to get any significant uplift on a site and any kind of regulatory model working. I mean, one of the things I'm just keen to know a bit more about, if we take one of the sites, for instance, where you talked about down at the harbour, and the government are selling off the land to fund transport infrastructure. So you've got a 25% model of affordability there, but how extensive is the regulation around it? I mean, have you got height limits already set? Is there a need to be investing into the public realm? I mean, one of the things that I was amazed about walking around the harbour was how good the public realm was. I mean, it's quite incredible the quality of it. So in terms of a developer buying a site, you know, how can the land value, is that something that's set? You know,
it's a negotiation with the city and harbour, the company made by the municipality and the state, what the land should cost or what the plot should cost.
Yeah.
And you can say, if you as a private developer buy a certain size of plot, then you are asked to build 25% social housing, and you then need to earn the money on the market-driven part of your plot. So
is there a negotiation in that? I mean, can you trade off in terms of building height and density?
No, that is given by that's planned by the municipality.
Yeah.
So it's a funny where the municipality sets the demands, but the company selling the land are also owned by the municipality, but are a private company where they own 99.5% of the shares in City and Harbour. But it is a difficult, the thing is to get the quality high enough, because you can easily build housing which has a ridiculously bad quality, and that's of course not what the municipality wants either. They want to sell the plot at a fair price, a market price, and then they want the developer to build social housing at a nice quality, and the quality is defined by a price per square meter. It's 11,500 Danish kroner per square meter. Right. If the cost is higher than that, you don't get subsidies for the social housing.
I was going to ask that's one of the questions.
It's an upper limit that defines everything within that sector. Yeah. They need to execute everything within a fixed square meter price.
Yeah. But that's the incredible thing. There's certainty in that. There's so much uncertainty, I think, in our housing sector in terms of how you fund it and subsidise it and the construction costs.
Yeah. And also when we go into wood, they still want to be kind of competitive, and that of course also have with the density and how high you can build in wood in terms of fire and in terms of the kind of structure you need to do that. So it's something that are being worked on by many different parties at the moment to get all these things to move in the same direction.
I'm curious about this. I mean, again, I was quite blown away by how much of Danish culture now is looking at upcycling and is there a new kind of construction economy around this? Are we creating a new marketplace, off-site construction? Is there a new economy that's starting to develop? Different job.
That's how we see it and how our politicians see it. They are pushing for everything that goes in terms of new sustainable businesses. You know, we have a huge kind of history with wind energy that we are kind of exporting globally. We are world leaders in that back from the 60s and 70s, actually coming out of our co-op history. So we see this as a kind of a pivotal point where everything basically needs to be redefined. The government are pushing money into new green economy in every kinds of way possible. And also that they're actually seeing Corona as and the current pandemic crisis as the opportunity to redefine many things, that some businesses will lower naturally, and we, by investing in the right areas, can bring the right kind of sustainable solutions forward.
There's several specific programs to supporting upcycling development by the government and also Real Dania. Experimental houses, also experimental programs where they involve the whole building sector, the demolition companies, how to track materials, all this kind of the whole regulation and infrastructural part that needs to be taken care of so it can be upscaled. That's also what's going on at the moment.
Yeah. The other question really I was curious about the youth housing. So the project that you've just completed, that you've still to get fully photographed. I mean, there's a huge amount of social space in there, which again, I'm curious about the funding mechanism for that, because you've got such a strong emphasis on the social. But I mean, again, from a developer's perspective, how do you? There's a commercial challenge in some of that. So how is that operated and managed?
But it's again by the regulation is that a youth housing subsidy unit can only be 65 square meters. And you know the 11,500 kroner per square meter. So you know the kind of business case you're working on. Then we take as many square meters out as possible, because that's the square meters we need to create these kind of social areas. But the people renting the unit still pay for the common spaces.
Yeah.
So if you rent an apartment, it's actually only 45 square meters, but you pay for 65 square meters. Yeah. But you then have all the shared space in the scheme, which you can use freely. Yeah. So it's that kind of thinking that, yeah. But the economy per square meter is the same as building some of the social housing schemes and so on. It's always the 11,500 per square meter. Yeah. And so then what you put into your kind of package, what I think is interesting is the next one being built next to it or in the adjacent neighborhood, what would that have of common facilities that would make that more attractive for the people letting it? I mean, it's also that I think what we're trying to show in the lecture is housing can be many different things. It can have both the context as I mean, living by the harbor is an obvious kind of quality, but it can also have other qualities like being prepared for you becoming older, for instance. Could be you're 50 years old, your children are leaving you, they're getting their own place, and you're standing in a life situation where you might even be single, but your kids come once in a while and live in your apartment or in your house. Yeah. That is a completely new, and that has to do with the 7 or the 37 different family kind of forms. You know, that we can't keep on doing housing as housing for 2 adults with 2 kids when 50% of grown-ups live alone.
But how much of that are you influencing in a project? I mean, how much, as the architect, are you getting the chance to shape that discussion? How much of it is coming via the government or the developer? So that 30
yeah, it's a mix basically, but what we also see is that architects are also sitting on the client side. Yeah. You know, they are also working in the client's organization. They're also working in the municipality, in the government. We are everywhere basically trying to make a movement and restructuring the way we think about housing, because it is a bit like we said earlier that the welfare state was built, we just built housing like we need it for young families after the war, but now we are restructuring it and we need to reconsider and look at what are we actually needing? What are our dreams? Kind of what do we want our housing to be able to do?
That's basically also our motivation and why we work as client consultants as well. Half of what we do for the government or the municipal, or actually formulating the programs for the buildings. We just formulated the program for the coming largest wooden building in Denmark, which is a government building. But I mean, it's like we're not designing it, but we're formulating the framework and premises for it. So it's like that's also a way for us to work within that. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the role of the architect and government. I'm sure there'll be people listening in tonight that'll resonate with. Now, I just noticed Ron McGorn's asked a very specific question about the youth housing. And Rob's asking, could you outline how many youth are in the project? And could you talk a bit more about the demographic profile and mix? So of the youth housing.
Is it 150?
Yeah, I think so. Approximately 150, if we remember right. And basically, youth housing in Denmark, you can apply as a student via university or another kind of school, and they try to then recruit students from various kinds of schools, whether it's technical schools or carpenter schools or academic schools. So you get a mix there. This student housing has a special entrepreneur profile, what do you call it, like startup profile. So also student directions that are sort of underlaying that theme will get in more easily. So that's how they do it.
But there's been a huge demand for youth housing, you know, like all over Europe, basically. And those projects are, there's going to be built a lot more of those. I think just in Copenhagen, we need like 30,000 or something units.
I'm going to talk about research in a second. I think I'm curious about the research part of all of this. But Donald's asked the question here. It would seem that there is considerable consensus within Danish culture and politics which have led to the processes and policies for social housing. The high percentage of affordable housing for all projects, etc. Is this sense of consensus so ingrained that all projects move in this direction, or is there resistance or reaction against these tendencies?
Oh, I mean, there's a huge consensus, and the Social Housing Association are really well established back in the days of the forming of the welfare society and the whole co-op movements. So basically, they are a very powerful conglomerate of different housing associations. They are well organized. They are accumulating all the renters' money from like 50 years back. So they are sitting on billions of kroners, which they use then to refurbish their own projects and develop new and build new. So it's a very much consensus part, but it's been sort of maybe stagnated during the 80s and 90s. And what we see now is that they are really at the forefront of developing new types of housing and more sustainable housing, and also forming new partnership with private developers and government. So it's sort of a consensus-based thing, but it's also been a heavy sector for many years, but things are really happening now.
You can say that perhaps the resistance comes on a larger scale. For instance, Copenhagen, when you see these fairly dense areas being built, some people doesn't like the idea. They want Copenhagen to be as it was. They want to keep the old harbor. They want to keep what you saw, the old fisherman culture, all these things. So they ask, why are we not developing further in the suburbs? Why are we not building in the suburbs like we did in the 60s and 70s? For instance, the new island we are going to build, it's actually financed by the dirt and this excess soil from building. Yeah. We need to find a place for that. We build a new island that also kind of make a kind of defense against the flooding in the future. But there people ask, why are we putting so much money into that instead of refurbishing the suburbs and developing that further? So that there is what we are showing from Copenhagen is the central of Copenhagen has a very unique place in Denmark also. It's prominent places, whereas the suburbs are dealing with problems in different ways. They have a higher degree of social housing. They have a detached housing and so on.
But also it's a constant struggle of keeping affordable housing within the city. So average people with average income can stay in the city. That's a sort of a global issue. So that's why you have to regulate. That's why the social housing associations are on the block here to be a part of that development.
And can I just ask about, I mean, there's quite clearly, I mean, the word, I think you talked about, I don't know, many times you mentioned the word experiment in the presentation. There's quite clearly a culture of trying to drive experimentation through the work you do, whether it's in construction, technology, programmatically, or in the financing and social spaces. But I mean, that's something that quite clearly is ingrained in the culture of the place, in the community of architecture practices, and in government. There seems to be an acceptance in government and with the contractors. You need a construction culture that embraces this rather than a risk-averse culture. So,
but I think this need for experiment comes out of necessity. I mean, we are a small country, and we are, as we said earlier, our economy are based on exports and our interaction with everybody basically, and the pressure on our welfare state is due to the demographic changes, is that we cannot continue as we have done earlier. I mean, we are getting older and older. We have bigger and bigger healthcare expenses. All of these things are pushing us to think differently all the time. So I think in that sense, Denmark is it's probably the same everywhere. But we always feel we're in a place of transition,
yeah.
You know, and trying to be at the forefront of that and make the right decisions at the right time. Like, for instance, the pension age are being discussed now. We have a pension age of 70. So that's the regulation now. And the kind of government economist said this week that we need to go higher. Whereas in Southern Europe, you are at your pension age is 60 years old. So they need to, Italy and Spain and those places need to finance an aging population which go out of work when they're 60 years old, and it's just not feasible. But we are pushing it to. I mean, we are probably never going to stop working here because.
But you also see many of the sectors actually experimenting and doing new stuff because it pays off. I mean, many of the developers that are growing these years, they are the most experimental, and they see that it pays off. It sees that all kind of soft issues like upcycling or social initiatives, it actually pays off economically as well. So that's a part. But saying that, still the major mass of what being built this last 10 to 15 years has been sort of one economical model of one specific way of doing fast building, earning a lot of money, speculating on it, and it's that part that we need to push into thinking differently and regulating it differently, give new incentives for it, and basically the housing laboratory which we are running are doing that. We are stimulating the experimental part, which you often can't afford or do have time for. So we give out money to these 7 projects. We arrange these workshops and hire in experts and work specifically with the issues they are struggling with.
Yeah. And let's hope that REORGANIZE have got some link into Australia so we can. Now, Alex Felsen, who's our new chair of landscape architecture, has got a question about, he said one of the interesting takeaways from the lecture is how the historic housing projects organise the architecture in relation to landscape. And I know you've got, and obviously are really, ingrained in the practice is the influence and impact of landscape on your projects. But he's saying there were private outdoor spaces, shared public spaces, natural areas and ponds in the foreground. Can you talk a bit more about how this hierarchy of landscape has changed and how your projects work across this range of landscape spaces?
It's very present in all development in Denmark. I mean, it's like the public spaces and the recognition of the meaning of that is sort of well documented and well supported in Denmark, and especially the largest city. It pays off economically. It gives a higher life quality for everyone. It attracts the families with kids to still live in the city. As part of that, there's new criteria of the climate change crisis. So there's imminent demands of every new development have to handle all climate issues, infuse more biodiversity and nature in the city. So it's a regulative thing, and sort of from the government and the municipals to think those two together. Sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. But I mean, it's like Copenhagen just built the new power plant with a ski hill and on top. So it's like they also are putting actions behind their ideas. Yeah.
Now, I'm just conscious of time, but just to try and squeeze in another 2 questions, max. So I wanted to ask about the research culture. I mean, I know you're working on another book, which is a bit more, it relates to research. I mean, is there a culture of post-occupancy? And is there a culture of research at the front end as well? So some of the demographic modelling you're talking about, I mean, is that something that government are pushing, or do you see an opportunity for proper research partnerships and longitudinal studies?
I think, yeah, it's definitely very present on many projects that, for instance, the projects supported by Realdania, the foundation we mentioned, all needs to have a kind of a research part to it. You need to have evidence for the kind of things you achieve through these projects. So it's very present on many levels in our society that we document and show how things actually work.
And share the knowledge afterwards.
And share the knowledge afterwards, yeah.
And what role are the universities playing in any of this, or are they playing any role at all in the research culture?
I mean, there's within the architecture school, there's a big research going into housing and these areas from the 50s and 60s and so on, and they are very present in many projects.
The first old architect Morten showed, Kai Fisker, which was sort of one of the founders of the welfare architecture. He was a professor at the Architect Academy here, and he actually founded a department called Housing Laboratory in the 50s, and it sort of went on for many years. It's no longer more there, but that's sort of, we are inspired for that name, and sort of we took it up in a new way now. So it's like it's a very much integrated part of it, I will say. Yeah.
And the last question really is about, I mean, there's quite clearly a generation of practices that are really well established now. I mean, NORD's been going for 17 years. You've got quite an incredible portfolio of work now across housing, healthcare, and I'm curious about the next generation. Is there a strong culture coming through now of younger practices? Have we seen that emerge?
Yeah, there are some names. The interesting there is that they are actually looking even more back in history than our generation. So that's really, they are having another starting point where it's like about materiality and old building techniques. So it's sort of the more looking towards that side.
But yeah, one thing that happened in the kind of architecture field is also that big architectural practices has been bought up by engineering companies. It's happened also in UK and other places in the last 20 years. So that's another big change, that we as architect practices have had our own little bubble globally also, that we have been independent. We've been able to collaborate with different people all the time. And now these big companies want architects, and they're buying up architects to get
The whole package.
Yeah, to get the whole package. So that is a change we are really into. Like Henning Larsen, one of the biggest companies, were bought up by Rambøll half a year ago.
Rambøll is an engineer company.
Yeah. So it's interesting what's going to happen. But these companies also work globally. So they work in the States, they work in India, and so on, and have a hard time being 300 people working in the States. So they are looking at another scope of projects, but trying to bring Danish design thinking to other places.
Fantastic. Well, look, we've gone 2 minutes over. But look, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us. It was a fantastic lecture. As I said, we're all quite envious, I think, about the culture that emanates in Copenhagen. I think more importantly, we all need to be congratulated that you gave a whole lecture and we've had 33 questions and nobody mentioned Jan Gehl once. So well done.
We'll start with him next time.
So fantastic. Look, really good to see you both. And
thanks.
I hope the next time we get together, I can maybe see you in Europe at some point and see some of the work you're doing. So
definitely.
Keep up the good work and keep in touch. Fantastic.
Cool. Keep safe.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.
And thanks to everyone for listening in. Just a reminder on the screen, we've got another MSD at Home on the 27th of October. And keep an eye out on our website for any future talks. Thank you. And enjoy the rest of your day.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.